Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 2, monasticism. Now, this lecture um, is a thematic lecture, so that certainly there will be overlaps chronologically with the previous lecture, um, which was, I know, a wazoo lecture, and my apologies for that, but I think it was necessary to get it all in. And therefore, too, foreshadows some of the developments that will come, because monasticism became a foundational um, institution of Christendom. And we'll see how that develops, um, on the basis of which it developed, and go from there. Because I think to us today, for most of us, um, being a monk is rather odd. Now, it could be weird. I mean, it could be my assumption. Um, also depends on all kinds of things in terms of how one views monasticism today. I have joked, only somewhat tongue in cheek, that actually I'm a 14th century Augustinian hermit myself, simply one living in the 21st century married with children. But that's more about me personally than anything else. But we won't understand Christendom unless we understand some of the basic issues of monasticism. So that's where this comes into play, because, too, as I will mention, with the Carolingians, which will be the topic of the next lecture, with Charlemagne, there was a lot of centralization that was going on in terms of the formation of Christendom. And one of those aspects was the centralization or the standardization. The centralization and standardization kind of go hand in hand. I'll be talking a lot more about that next lecture. But here we find the Carolingians, or, well, I'm pointing to this. We see within the Carolingian world an attempt to standardize monastic life. And we'll see what that was based on and how that came to be as well. And that provided then the basis for a whole series of monastic reforms, which begins where this course starts, actually a little bit before, because we first major reform movement was with Cluny, which was established in 910 CE, so a little bit before, but around the year 1000, things really start developing, and they just kind of go from there in terms of different forms of monastic life. But at this time, within Christendom, monks were part of the structures of society. Yes, they were supposed to be withdrawn from society. I'll be talking more about that later, but still they were a fundamental aspect of the structures of Christendom. So that's why I want to deal with monasticism um, kind of separately or distinctly, separate from the general chronological development, so that when we do get into these reform movements in the chronological period of the course proper, so to speak, in the High and Later Middle Ages, we'll have this background already established in terms of what constitutes monasticism, where did it come from, how does it really function within society. So that's what this lecture is about. And we need to start then, as we see with that first slide there, with discussing the concept of asceticism. Because Christian monasticism, I'm not going to deal with other forms of monasticism, but Christian monasticism had its foundation in some ways in Greek thought. Now, we still know the term asceticism today, and someone who is an ascetic is someone who's very self-disciplined, um, very frugal, denies oneself, etc. That's different from aesthetic, which is beauty, but ascetic comes from the Greek ascesis, which in Latin was translated as disciplina, which is the basis of our word discipline. And the whole point was to discipline oneself. Now, on this first slide with asceticism, I have the Greek hieresis, and I believe I mentioned hieresis, or what became heresy, originally was simply a Greek term to refer to the type of philosophical school one chose to follow. Now, there's an issue with philosophy. in terms of the Greek philosophy and the Greek schools of philosophy. Because the definition of philosophy, and what it literally means, is the love of wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom. How do you go about that? And this gets to this distinction, a Greek distinction between body and soul. Because wisdom is of the mind, it's not of the body. And if you are trying to dedicate your life to pursuing wisdom, somehow pursuits that seem to focus on the body are antithetical to that. So the idea among some Greek hierases, schools of philosophy, was that to be a philosopher, you had to discipline yourself. Because you can't pursue wisdom if you're, hungry and thinking about what do I want to eat, or what do I want to drink, or whom do I want to sleep with tonight, and what are we going to do? All those kinds of things, those bodily needs or urges or desires, were undermining of the spiritual life of pursuing wisdom, which was the love of wisdom, and therefore was the philosophical life. Now, not all Greek philosophy or philosophers felt that you had to be an ascetic, but many did. And it's self-discipline, because if I can discipline myself not to be distracted by my bodily urges, needs, desires, then I can focus on my mind more so than I can if I'm distracted by it. So if I can discipline myself not to be taken away by hunger or thirst or sexual drive, but to limit that. Now, there is a close relationship between asceticism and Stoicism, which was one of the major Greek philosophical schools, which became very prevalent too within Rome. And the Stoics, and I think I may have addressed this previously in the last lecture, but I don't remember if I did or not, I'm sorry, are often contrasted with the Epicureans, another Greek philosophical school. And the caricaturization of the Epicureans were those who were even the Epicurus, from Epicurus, the philosopher Epicurus, sort of the Epicurean pig, because it tried to maximize pleasure. That was a misunderstanding of what the Epicureans were actually about. It was not debauchery. An Epicurean was saying, okay, what does it mean to be happy? And for the Epicurean, if I can maximize pleasure, that will contribute to, or actually be needed for, being happy, whatever that means. And happy was not simply pleasure. It was, in Latin, beata vita, the blessed life, was the happy life. And what does it take to be happy? That is still a philosophical question we haven't solved today. But the Epicureans knew very well that if you so-called overdid it, pleasure would lead to pain. And if you've ever gone out drinking and really overdid it, and you wake up in the morning and think, oh my God, why did I do that? You know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, well, good for you. But I still think you can understand. If you overeat, all of a sudden you start feeling, ooh, I ate too much. Too much pleasure can lead to pain. So the Epicureans were very much looking for that golden mean, which was a more general Greek ideal. The golden mean of when do you reach that curve where pleasure, if I can do this curve this way, pleasure maximizes here before it starts descending into displeasure or pain. The Stoics, on the other hand, approached the same issue, but differently, because they said, okay, if we can minimize pain, that will contribute to overall happiness. So the Stoic position was we need to discipline ourselves not to feel pain. There's some amazing stories of classical Stoics who did that. Um, and I could go on and on and on about that, but both the Stoics and the Epicureans were striving for the same ideal: how to be happy, how to find that sweet spot, so to speak, in living, that we could be happy more often than we would not be, and then we would be in pain or discomfort or misery. So that is this sense of, okay, if, from the Stoic position, if I can discipline my body not to feel pain, that will increase my pleasure overall. Now, those two kind of ideas led to this concept of asceticism or discipline, because an Epicurean had to be disciplined too to know when was too much. That golden mean takes discipline, just a different approach to it from the different side, either maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain. Now, that's kind of a reduction, but that's kind of, in general, puts those out there. And asceticism was important for both. Now, in the Christian tradition, we then have the idea of still, how do we find happiness? What is the blessed life? And in some ways, that was one of the answers, was it's Christianity. But then what? How do we live a Christian life? And I think I mentioned and talked about the rise of Christianity last lecture, and one of the questions was, who was Jesus of Nazareth, and what difference does that make of how we describe or define who Jesus was, etc. And we have the creed already with the Council of Nicaea, and on we go. But another major question was, how do we live a Christian life? What does it mean? And that was something that then also was very early on. And if we turn here to the Anchorites and the Cenobites, there are two different monastic forms, which I'll be getting to. From early on in the Christian tradition, we have this idea of, what does it mean to live as a Christian? We see that in the Christian scriptures in Acts 4, basically, I believe it's verses 32 to 35, about living in common, how the first apostolic community, that means the apostles who knew Jesus, who were following Jesus, they lived in a community, distributing each to every, as they needed, having, property in common. And if you didn't follow that rule, you could be, catch hell for it, so to speak. The story of Ananias and Sapphira, for those of you who know Christian scriptures, know what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, a married couple, Ananias and Sapphira, wanted to join the Christians, the apostles, and join this community whereby they were supposed to have brought all of their property to give to the apostles, and then the apostles would distribute it according to need. So they have this common life. And Ananias went first, and he went in and he thought, I'm going to keep some for ourselves. And so he lied. And when Peter asked him, is this everything? He says, yes, it is. And Peter says, oh, no, it's not. You go to hell. You're dead. And basically he dies. And they bury him. And Sapphira comes in, not knowing what had happened, and says, Peter asks, so Sapphira, is this all your property? She says, yes. But no, it wasn't. And she said, well, you're going to be buried next to your husband. Boom, out she goes and she dies. So the whole point was, lying was wrong. It was more the lying than the trying to keep something for themselves. But that first apostolic community became the model of how to live what became referred to as the apostolic life, the Vita the Vita Apostolica. Sorry. I'm tired. I'm not sure why I can't get that. The Vita Apostolica. Sorry, the apostolic life. The life according to the apostles, the first followers of Jesus. And then the question became, okay, well, what happens? How do you really put this into practice once the movement begins to grow and expand beyond that original community of Acts? Does everyone have to live in such a community? Well, there's another model too, because if you want to say, okay, I want to follow Jesus and imitate Jesus, that means I'm going to go out and preach the gospel to people. You need preparation for it, you need training for it. What did Jesus do before he started his public ministry? He went into the desert to face temptation, the temptation of the devil, of Satan. Famous story of, the three temptations or so. I forget what, turn these rocks into bread, because he spent 40 days and 40 nights in the desert alone. He was hungry. And Jesus says, man shall not live by bread alone. He shall not live by bread alone. Then it's like, okay, if you, I forget the others, it was, cast yourself down, because it's also said that, that God won't allow you to hurt yourself, and the angels will save you. It says that you should not tempt your Lord your God. And then it's like, the last one was showing him all the kingdoms of the earth and saying, just worship me and I will give you all of these. And Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. Now, that idea of before I can go and preach the gospel, I must test myself to be sure that I am prepared to do so, just the way Jesus did. So I'm going to go into the desert. And we have from early on individuals, hermits, who went into the desert in Egypt to begin with. Egyptian desert, the Desert Fathers, as they became called as. And they lived as hermits, as anchorites, because in Greek, anchorite, it means hermit. Big deal. So you go into the desert, you leave society, just like Jesus did, before you can start, living within a monastic community or an apostolic life. And the devil is pretty tempting. St. Anthony experienced this. He's one of the first desert fathers. Paul, the first hermit, is another one that was repeatedly referred to. And on we go. Now, the point here is, too, that it was difficult. And I often make the analogy with, either vowing to yourself to start, a diet. So I'm going to lose 15 pounds, or I'm going to lose 20 pounds. And I'm going to do so by watching what I eat and by working out. So I'm also going to start this working out routine. And you do it for a while, and it goes pretty well. And then you feel, oh, I really don't feel like it this morning, getting up and going to the gym. I've been really good, so I'm not going to. I'll just skip it today. No big deal. Or I'm going to eat this piece of pie because I've been denying myself. So I've been doing a great job with it. No big deal. But once you then do that, you start doing it again, and it's easy to fall away. It's typical. New Year's resolution. I'm going to lose 10 pounds, or I'm going to go to the gym, 3 times a week, or not every day. And it works for a week or 2 or 3, and then it doesn't. That's because doing it on your own is problematic. If you do it with a buddy, with a friend, it's easier. Still not necessarily guaranteed success, but it's easier because if you say, okay, Bob or Jim or Betty, or people don't name their kids Betty anymore, do they? Anyway, or Jim. No, well, James. James still is good. Let's go to the gym. We'll do it together, 6:30 a.m. every morning. And then after, a week, Monday comes around. It's like, I don't feel like it. So it's like, I'm just going to take this a little day off, and it gets to be 6:15, and then your buddy calls you up and says, hey, aren't we going to go to the gym? It's more difficult to tell your friend, no, I'm not going to do it today. It's like, no, because a friend will say, you got to, because we promised we would. Oh, damn it, okay, I'll go. The idea was that you can discipline yourself, because doing things like going to the gym or trying to lose 15 pounds or whatever requires discipline, self-discipline, to not listen to your body that's telling you you don't want to do this, or yes, you do want to eat that piece of pie, etc. Now, that being said, that became another form of Christian life. Cenobit, Cenobit, Cenobitism. That's not pronounced correctly, I'm sorry. Which means living in a community. A Cenobite was living in a group out in the desert, whereas an anchorite was living on your own out in the desert. So we have these two forms, the hermits and those living in community. Anchoritic monasticism and Cenobitic monasticism. And the Cenobites became far more prevalent than the anchorites. And then we have the problem because we start having a mixed form. Anchorites are hermits, but being a hermit within a community of hermits. Say how that's possible. Yes, well, they had individual cells, but they still lived in a group. So it became this mixed form of anchoritic and cenobitic life. You are a hermit, you're still an anchorite and a hermit, but you do so in a community of other hermits. So now we have kind of three groups. We have the hermits, we have the Cenobites, and we have the anchoritic Cenobites, the hermits in community. But all those different types of life, they're extreme forms, because no one ever said to be a Christian you must go out into the desert. It's like, if I take my belief seriously enough, what does it mean to follow Jesus? That's a big question at the time, and it was. How do we do so? Can we do so if we don't join a community, if we don't go out into the desert? How can we live a Christian life? But that form of doing so, that let's say extreme, because it was even extreme at the time, that extreme form of dedication to living a Christian life became known as the perfect life. Now, the Cenobites were the apostolic life, because that lived in a community. There weren't hermits in Acts. That was the apostolic life. But then the apostolic life joined with the anchoritic life to form the perfect life, the vita perfecta. Now, we will go out on that later and see developments and different definitions thereof later, because those things start to change. But that's the origins of it. And the whole point of monasticism is that the term monk is monachos. Monachos means one. One person, one individual, a monachos, a single individual, which is kind of been based on being an anchorite, but within a community, then you have a monastic community. Now, that's kind of some of the origins and background. And then we have, there is a distinction between Eastern monasticism and Western monasticism. Eastern meaning within the Greek view of things in the Greek church. But here I'm going to be focusing on Western monastic ideals, okay? Because it's kind of like, as the church developed itself, it split apart into East and West with different traditions. And I'm not trying to say that the Eastern part is not important. It is, but especially with the linguistic difference between Greek and Latin and the increasingly monolingual nature of, let's say, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire is what developed into Christendom. Now, that being said, once you are living in a community, right? Issue is, how do you do so? What are the rules for the community? In Latin, the term for rule is regula. And with us too, rule is the same as a ruler, a measure of things. And so a rule was designed to measure and give you a measurement of the type of life that you were supposed to be living if you were going to be living in this community. The first Western monastic rule we have is the rule of St. Augustine, or the Regula Sancti Augustini. Now, Augustine, as you need to know because you've read, I forget what chapter Augustine is. If it was for reading for this week or next week, you will read about Augustine. One of the longest chapters in the Myth of the West, because that's whom I study, one of the people I study. There's been a long history about the so-called Regula Sancti Augustini, whether or not it actually was written by Augustine. It is, to make a long story short, a Dutch scholar, Luc Verheyen, in the later 1960s, published a 2-volume study in French, arguing that of all the different texts that were circulating within Europe under the title The Rule of St. Augustine, the Regula Sancti Augustini, one of them is legitimate, namely what's called the Praeceptum. There are others that have been kind of circulated with that, distinct from that, and part of it gets to be a really textual mess. But his argument was that this one form was authentic Augustine. Now we know from Augustine's sermons in his letters and things, he did desire to live a monastic life. And after his conversion in Milan, as that chapter talks about, etc., and he goes back to Africa, and his idea was to live in this community with his friends, devoted to God, to be a servus Dei, a servant of God, sitting around drinking wine and talking about philosophical and theological issues. Great life, right? And then he got sucked into becoming a priest and had to start living a different life, an active life. And here's another distinction in terms. The vita activa, the active life, became or was referred to living within society, within, not in a monastic community, but within the secular world, which actually is a contradiction in terms, because at this time saeculum just meant the world. The secular was not then distinct from the religious. It was the secular became distinct from following a monastic rule, which I'll come back to shortly. But if you are involved in being a priest, and then for Augustine, a bishop, even more so, you had to deal with people's confessions. You had to deal with preaching and, celebrating the sacraments. You had to deal with all kinds of problems, politically, legally. You could not devote yourself to contemplation, and that's the other side of things, the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life. So we have the active life and the contemplative life. And the monastic approach was very much the contemplative life. So you could just definitely devote yourself to contemplation of God and the truth and how best to live a Christian life. If you know the scriptures, this goes back to Mary and Martha with Jesus. Anyway, that's not all that essential, even though those became models. And Jesus said that Mary, who became representative of the contemplative life, had chosen the better path. Not that he said that Martha's concern for getting dinner ready and helping and cleaning up and all that was wrong. Not at all. It wasn't condemned. It just said that Mary chosen better. Now, anyway, the point being, contemplative life, active life. Monk, active. Augustine wanted to continue living this contemplative life. And so we know from his authenticated sermons and letters and things, that when he became a priest, Bishop Valerius of Hippo gave him a garden to form a monastery in which he could live a monastic life, even though he was going to be serving the parish and the diocese as priest. Then when Augustine became bishop, he had to move into the bishop compound of the cathedral. He established another monastery within the episcopal compound, where he let where he lived with his priests. So he has these two monastic communities that have been legitimated and authenticated. Now, the question always was, for which did he write his rule? Well, he doesn't tell us that. And there's arguments that he wrote it for the Garden Monastery. There are good arguments that he wrote it for the Episcopal Monastery. And these two forms became a major debate later in the course of the course, as we will see, but it goes back to this original approach. Now, I think that is about all I'm going to say at this point. I have up there following Augustine's examples, hermits or canons. That became actually a later debate because it was seen at Garden Monastery was seen as a monastery of anchoritic Cenobites, of hermits living in community, the same way as his home in Tagasta when he first went back from Milan after his conversion, sitting there with his friends, which has also been seen as, or was seen as, a first monastery. So whether he established two or three, we know that he established two. Now, the reason this is problematic is because the monastery that he established within the episcopal compound as bishop was for his priests. So now we have priests who were supposed to be monks. We have then priests who, by definition, lived the active life, who were living the contemplative life. Became known as the vita mixta, the mixed life. In time, this didn't really apply to Augustine's time in the 4th, early 5th century. But later on, it said, don't ask me, Professor Sack, when was the first canon? I'm not sure. But the priests serving a cathedral. A cathedral is the bishop's church. You can't have a bishop without having a cathedral. You can't have a cathedral without having a bishop. Especially as we go on into the Middle Ages, go on into the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. Bishops, as I think I mentioned, became excuse me, princes, basically, part of a lot of the nobility. They didn't want to sit around and preach every day. They didn't want to listen to everybody's confessions. They would come in and preach on Easter, maybe at Christmas. They wanted to live as princes, and they did. The origins of the term later prince bishop. But the pastoral work of the cathedral, which was for the entire diocese, still needed to be done. So what they started doing was appointing priests who by definition were in charge of a parish. Priest, parish, bishop, diocese. And parishes were underneath or within a diocese, underneath a bishop. But a priest then that would be appointed to serve the parish of the cathedral was not the bishop, became known as canons, the canons of the cathedral. And in time, they were the ones that then would elect a new bishop. Now, in some ways, the model goes back to Augustine, because what we will see when we get there, in a couple of weeks anyway, is in the course of the 11th, 12th century, there began to be movements that among the canons that we should also live according to monastic rule, that we should follow the rule of St. Augustine, because that was the idea he wrote it for his canons, as it became known, to be how to be a priest and live in community and still serve the cathedral. Now that became a major debate later, which we'll get to. But this was the origins of it. And the problem was that Augustine's rule, after Augustine's death in 430, after North Africa was overrun by the Vandals and then by Islam, dispersed. And it was not unknown, but it was not then the major form of monasticism, even though there were groups that fled North Italy that can be traced somewhat, not completely in any way, shape, or form, but somewhat that probably still did follow Augustine's rule, but we can't say for sure. But the tradition of Augustine's rule in following the Regula Sancti Augustini not only led to the canons of the cathedral eventually, but also then to the hermits. That garden monastery kind of had its tradition, and then the monastery within the Episcopal compound had its tradition, and we will see in our course that these traditions came into conflict in the later Middle Ages over which was most authentically the true sons of Augustine. But we'll get there when we get there. That's the issue that was going on. But that whole approach, as I said, the Regula Sancti Augustini after the 5th century, and then with the rise of Islam, became dispersed. And what do we do? And what became the standard monastic rule of the West, eventually, was known as the rule of Saint Benedict, the Regula Sancti Benedicti. And that is what the Carolingians made the standard for the monastic life. Now, there's a problem here. And historiographically, much debated. I believe it was in the late 80s, I believe. A scholar by the name of Francis Clark published 2 volumes called the Pseudo-Gregorian Dialogues, in which he argued that this work called the Dialogues, which had been attributed to Pope Gregory the Great, who became like the 4th church father, early or late 6th century, early, dies in 604, I think, was a forgery. It wasn't actually by him. And the problem here is that the earliest and only evidence we have for there ever having been historically a figure by the name of Saint Benedict, or Benedict, who became a saint, who established a monastery at, Eric, Monte Cassino in Italy, is in those dialogues. Now, Clark argued that those dialogues date from the later 7th century, and they were a Carolingian forgery applied to, or attributed to, Pope Gregory the Great. And he goes through all the manuscript evidence, shows that there's no reference to the rule of St. Benedict before the later 7th century. There's no evidence of a monastery at Monte Cassino until the early 8th century, and on it goes. And also pointed out, as a figure, St. Benedict is Benedictus, and he had a sister, Scholastica. So brother and sister both became saints. Saint Scholastica was Benedict's sister. Blessed person, Benedictus is one who is blessed. And maybe why? Because his sister is Scholastica, or scholar. All seems very plausible. And to me, I have not seen an adequate refutation of Clark's work. Now, when he came out to say that, St. Benedict never lived, the rule of St. Benedict is a forgery too, therefore, it's like, oh no, I mean, it was a huge controversy. And Benedictines are still one of the major monastic groups today. And many other groups besides the Order of St. Benedict follow the Benedictine rule. So it's like it was a boom. And all of this opposition. And there's some good points. I'm not going to go into that whole debate, but the point here is that Historically, it's difficult to verify the historical existence of Saint Benedict, who supposedly lived in the late 6th century, and his foundation of Monte Cassino, which is more early 6th century. Yeah, I'm sorry, it was early 6th century, not late. Early 6th century. Monte Cassino, I think, was founded in like 521 or something like that. I don't have the date off the top of my head. Cannot be verified historically. And it's based on the authenticity of the dialogues of Gregory the Great and whether or not they are authentic. Because if they are authentic, it does not mean that therefore Benedict was, but at least Benedict could have been, if that makes sense. But if we have the earliest source referencing the rule of St. Benedict not until the late 7th century, seems pretty unlikely that Benedict was active in the early 6th century. Now, I just want to put that out there. But the rule of St. Benedict became the basis for Western monasticism because the Augustinian rule was still around, but only in very small groups and not really aware in hermetical groups, meaning hermits, groups of hermits who were living in the mountains and stuff. The rule of St. Benedict became the basis for Western monasticism, at least for quite a while. Now let's look at this. In the West, we're talking about how to live a monastic life in Europe. Can't go out into the desert. Not a desert anywhere near Europe, but what you could do is go into the woods, to the wilderness. And that's what they did. They withdrew from society and went into woodlands, deserted territories, into the wild, so to speak, and founded monasteries there.